So, Peter Kunzlik, professor and head of the law school at the University of East Anglia, and author of several books and reviews on environmental and sustainable subjects related to public procurement.
Thank you.
I'll give the stage to you. There's the audience. I hope you have your presentation in order.
Thank you. I hope so.
Yes.
Well, hello, everybody. I have two things to say before I start my main talk, and I am the second Peter, but that's not the first thing. The first thing is a confession. I have a confession for you, and that is that for most of the last 20 years, I've been regarded, certainly by European Commission officials, as something of a heretic, crazy, wild-eyed, strange person with bizarre ideas. And so I have to give you that health warning. But the crazy idea that I had back in 1998 was to argue that the European public procurement system should, but also did, allow public purchasers to favour in various ways the purchase of environmentally appropriate products. That was heresy. I used to get European Commission officials telling me, no, you just can't. And I would ask them, being a lawyer, why not? And they could never give me the answer. They just said, no, you just can't. So that was a bit of a challenge, and I therefore spent a lot of the last 20 years arguing that within limits imposed by the internal market, in principle, at various stages of the procurement process, public purchasers were able, for example, to say, we will only purchase timber products from sustainably harvested timber and so on. And I've had the delightful experience of, in my career, seeing that heresy has suddenly become respectable. Even Commission officials now agree with me, so that's a delightful experience. The problem, though, with being a heretic is it can become a habit. The reason I argued as I did was because it seemed to me that environmental protection was a very important value, and that through the democratic process, member states should be able to choose environmentally sensitive procurement within limits of the internal market, because that reflected the democratic process, and of course, it was national taxpayers' money that was being spent. So that if there was a tension between environmental purchasing and transaction costs, that should be decided by the national system because it's national taxpayers' money. Now, my habit of being a heretic leads me, having got to the comfortable position where my original ideas are respectable, to be skeptical about these new directives. Because as we shall see, these new directives don't only make clear that member states are permitted to do things in terms of green procurement, they impose obligations on member states. And I, for one, have never argued that the EU should be able to impose obligations on member states to engage in any particular form of strategic purchasing, largely because the EU is too distant from that democratic process that balances transaction costs against social values. And so that's my position. Now, although being a heretic can be a habit, part of me yearns to be in the mainstream. And I saw a slide go up before that said that 79% of you thought that the new directives would make procurement more complicated. And so because I would like to join that mainstream, I'm going to give my presentation in the hope that after it, 90% of you will share that view. And then I can be in my audience as part of the team, and I won't feel lonely anymore. Now, I've been asked particularly to look at the environmental aspect of sustainable procurement, and my slides are based, the references are based on the classical directive, the Public Contracts Directive, and on the final compromise text at that. So the Utilities Directive it mirrors these provisions, and the Concessions Directive includes quite a few of them. I just didn't want to confuse the slides by including all the different references or debating the specific detail differences. It would just be too confusing. So And of course, the numbers, the article numbers will change when we get the final directives, because there's still a bit of tidying up that will happen. So, my talk will cover these three grounds. First of all, I have to tell you a bit about Europe 2020 strategy, because you can't understand the directives without knowing a bit about that. Second, I want to look at the new approach that these directives have. It's fundamentally different from anything that's gone before, and some of the new principles involved. And then finally, we'll look at some particular impacts of the directives on specific aspects of the procurement process. So, Europe 2020. Now, there have been lots of worries about the competitiveness of Europe compared to the rest of the world. And since the European Union has some economic responsibility, some responsibility for our prosperity, they thought they better have a plan. And they came up with a cunning plan, and this plan is called the Europe 2020 strategy. And so far as green procurement's concerned, the points I've put on the board give you the gist of the strategy. The idea is Europe has a prime mover advantage in green and innovative technologies. Therefore, we should harness public sector demand to demand green, eco-innovative products. And that will create an incentive, a pull, for industry to develop these new products. And so European industry will develop a whole range of new environmental products, which in particular will be resource and in particular energy efficient. And that will be great for European competitiveness. Because the theory goes, then we'll be able to sell these new technologies around the world. We'll have an advantage in the global marketplace because all these other countries, which aren't quite as developed as we are in their environmental policies, they will follow us in due course, and we'll be able to sell all this wonderful technology into it. So there's a market, a world market for us. But at the same time, as the pull of public sector demand prompts the production of innovative new products, resource-efficient products, our own industries will get the benefit of that. So our other industries will become more resource efficient and therefore more competitive, whatever sector they're in. Now that's the theory. Whether you believe it or not is a matter for you. I'm not personally wholly convinced that this is the answer to all of Europe's economic woes. And my reservation about it is that, yes, at one point perhaps we did have a prime mover advantage, but the rest of the world has caught up very largely. I'm not sure that it will quite work, but this is the rationale behind a lot of the new directives. But there's a problem with it. The problem with the idea of harnessing public sector demand behind eco and innovative products is that, of course, public sector demand is very fragmented. Different public bodies, utilities, whatever, they might all seek different types of environmental solution. And so you're not going to get the pull that will create an incentive for industry to align a production at a given level, so it's not going to work. And that's why the directives contain a number of provisions that they do. And it's why the directives are part of a broader policy initiative on the part of the European Commission. First of all, in some limited sectors, the European Union has decided to go beyond permitting green procurement and has set new environmental standards in particular sectors specifically for public purchases. So, for example, as regards certain vehicles, as regards certain electrical products, Europe might have basic standards for the marketing of these products in the EU, but under a couple of instruments, public purchasers are required to only purchase products which achieve a higher standard set out in the directives. So mandatory directives, regulations about setting environmental procurement standards only applicable to public purchasers, that started on a sector-by-sector basis, only a few of them so far. The idea being that will align demand behind these standards, and therefore we'll get this market pull, and at the same time it will protect the environment. Secondly, and this is fundamentally important for the directives, public purchasers are going to be required to ensure compliance in the performance of their public contracts with certain obligations. And we'll look at that in more detail. Thirdly, one of the things that was thought by the European Commission to get in the way of galvanizing green procurement was they decided that the law wasn't sufficiently clear. It needed clarifying. And so the directive includes various provisions to clarify the law. I rather agree with Peter Trett. Most of the lack of clarity in the law was caused by the Commission itself. So it's now legislating to correct the problems that it caused itself with its own restrictive interpretations. And we'll see how that works later. And then finally, the provisions in the directive aimed at facilitating joint purchasing, centralized purchasing, although they can be justified perhaps in terms of the efficiency of purchasing, are also importantly justified on the basis that this will align demand. Because big purchasers of big values of products, if it's central purchasing, for example, will be better able to make the significant investment in establishing green public purchasing criteria and conditions than small ones will be. So that's also part of this plan to galvanize the use of green procurement in favor of the environment, but also as a central part of the EU's economic policy. So that's the context. Let's look now at the new approach. First of all, and it follows from what I've said, what's radically new is that procurement law isn't now being used to coordinate national policies. It's used as an instrument of European economic policy. That's fundamentally new. Secondly, the directive points out that it also has the goal of increasing the efficiency of public spending and supporting common societal goals, environmental, social, and so on. So that, if you like, in a procurement context, that could be thought of as a version of sustainable development. That is actually now stated as one of the objectives of the directive, which goes beyond what was there before. And that new approach is implemented by a couple of provisions which are called general principles. The first one will be familiar to you. It's the usual European stuff, equality, no discrimination, so on. It's the second one that's radically new. I call it the compliance principle, or the principle in Article 15.2. Member states shall take measures to ensure that in the performance of public contracts, economically operators comply with applicable obligations in the field of environmental, social, and labour law, established by union law, national law, collective agreements, or by the international environmental, social, and labour law provisions listed in the annex. Shall. It's mandatory. It's an obligation. It's a duty. Member states are under a duty to ensure this compliance. Well, what does it mean? There are, in fact, two types of obligation. The worst one are applicable obligations under EU national law. And for reasons which will become apparent, they seem to arise from the law of the place of execution, where the contract's being delivered. And then secondly, there are obligations under these international conventions in Annex 11. Let's look at them separately. The recital talks about applicable obligations as those that apply at the place where the works are executed or the services are provided, relating to the environment and so on. So if that would mean that the purpose of Article 15.2 is to say member states must ensure that contractors in public contracts meet environmental laws applicable at the place where works are being executed or services provided. Doesn't talk about supplies. Article 15.2 itself doesn't separate supplies. Article 15.2 itself is all public contracts, and yet this only relates to supplies. So there's a question. Does this obligation of compliance also apply to the purchase of goods? Now, interesting question, because one could say that this principle in the recital is all about ensuring territorial jurisdiction. That, of course, environmental and labour laws of the place where the contract's being performed should be complied with, but you shouldn't make it obligatory on a purchasing state to require compliance with the laws of another country. What you do there, where you've got an international element, you say compliance with the conventions. So where you're saying you've got to comply with the obligations from another country, that's limited to the obligations under these international conventions that are listed. Otherwise, if it's just EU or national law, it's the law at the place where the thing is done. And what that would mean, that would make sense of this recital only referring to works or services, because they're in your country. But what about the position of supplies? Let's say you want to purchase goods from a different country, and you believe, or you've got proper grounds to believe, these goods are being made by child labour in appalling conditions, where all these poor little children are dying of industrial diseases. Well, if supplies are excluded, and if there's a territorial principle behind that, you're not under duty anymore. You don't have to exclude that. Seem a bit odd. It would seem to go against some of the broader statements in the directive, but that's clearly a legal issue to be sorted out. And so we'll see. Remember my 90%? I want 90%. Do you think this is clear? Do you think this clarifies and simplifies the law? Well, we have some help, because where services are concerned, under the applicable local law, where are those services performed? They might be transnational services. And the answer is, it's at the place at which characteristic performance is delivered. Now, you may not know this, because it's necessarily none of your business to know it, but the concept of characteristic performance is a principle from European private international law. There's a whole body of law about contractual performance under various other European instruments, and that is now being brought into the procurement context. So as purchasing officers, you're going to have to develop a smattering of an understanding of private international law, at least to figure out where the characteristic performance is, although no doubt the court will tell you. The directive in recital 14D gives you a hint: call centres. It tells you where they are deemed to be provided, and that is the place where they're executed, not the place where the calls are taken. So, member states are, remember, under a duty to ensure compliance with these things, and these national measures, however, must be in conformity with basic principles of EU law and with the Posted Workers Directive. So if it's about minimum wages, for example, as in the Rufford case, you've got to know about that, or the member state must be aware of that, whilst it's ensuring compliance with these principles. Well, the second lot of principles in Article 15.2 are those listed in Annex 11, International Conventions. And here we have the social ones. This is all public international law. We have the social ones, and we have the environmental ones. So remember, the member state is under an obligation to ensure that, not the contracting authority, the member state is under an obligation to ensure that contractors comply with obligations under these provisions, public international law. And there are a number of means of ensuring compliance which impact on the procurement process. The first is that if an economic operator doesn't comply with these obligations, that is a non-compulsory ground for exclusion. So as long as you put it in your contract documentation, you can say we'll exclude if we have grounds to do that. So that's one means of ensuring compliance. The second is that the self-certification document, if you have stated that as a purchaser that you will exclude for non-compliance with these obligations, then the self-certification document must state that the economic operator complies. In the case of abnormally low tenders, where after investigation it appears that the tender is abnormally low because they're not complying with these obligations, then there is a duty on the contracting authority to exclude. It's no longer non-compulsory, it becomes compulsory at this point. So you guys who are purchasing officers will have to be able to figure this out. Am I getting you up to the 90%? I kind of hope so, because then I'll feel more comfortable. If the tender isn't abnormally low, you still have a non-compulsory, you have a discretion to decide not to award the contract to a tenderer submitting the best tender where you're satisfied on proper grounds that these obligations have not been complied with. Although I take Peter Chepter's point that if you've decided it is the best deal, it might be a brave person who then chooses to exercise that discretion. There are also provisions for enforcing compliance as regards subcontractors. And this is a very weirdly stated provision. It doesn't say shall or may, it just states it. Observance of the obligations in 15.2 by subcontracted is ensured by appropriate action by the competent national authorities. Well, what does that mean? Let's assume it means there's a duty to ensure, although we're not quite sure, but let's assume it means that. How might that duty be carried out? Well, where there is joint liability between the contractor and the subcontractor, the position is clear, because we're told that the member state concerned shall ensure that the relevant rules are applied in compliance with Article 15.2. So where there's joint liability, again, this reiterates the duty on the member state to make sure that the Article 15.2 obligations are complied with. However, where there is joint liability, the contracting authority, not the member state, the contracting authority may require, it's not a duty, it's a power, may require that the subcontractor which does not comply is substituted by one that does. So these are these enforcement provisions. Is this simplifying things for you? I hope it is. That is a fundamental change. All of that stuff, it's a fundamental change in EU regulation of procurement. It's no longer coordinating procurement, it's using procurement as an instrument of policy at a European level. Let's come now to the impact of specific rules in the directives about particular aspects of the procurement process. And there are 8 which I just want to touch on. And the first of them deals with technical specifications. The European Commission for a long time argued that when technical specifications were drafted, they could not include requirements relating to the process and production methods whereby the thing was produced, if it was a supply, unless those affected the characteristics of the product as bought at its consumption stage. And this was where my heresy arose, because I said, that's not what the directive says. Yeah. And my great good fortune was that in time the court came and agreed with me. Although I don't think they ever read anything that I wrote, but because it was clear even before this directive got to this stage that technical specifications in fact can and always could, within certain limits, impose requirements on the production and process methods whereby a product was produced, as long as, even though they didn't affect the substance of the thing purchased. And the case that made that abundantly clear was the Netherlands, the Commission in the Netherlands, the fair trade labelling case about coffee. But it was also implicit in lots of the earlier cases. Well, having spent the best part of 20 years saying you cannot specify requirements relating to PPMs that don't affect the final product, the Commission is now clarifying the law by telling us that we can, even though that was always the situation. So that's great, and that's consistent with Commission in the Netherlands. But, and this ties in with what Peter Chepter said earlier on, When the Commission simplifies these things and helps us out, and it reflects and codifies court decisions, or the Commission or the EU legislative process often add little conditions to it. And there's a very important one here, that this is all the case. Specifications can specify process and production methods linked to the subject matter of the contract. That's traditional. Including environmental or climate performance conditions at any stage of the life cycle of the product, even where they do not form part of the material substance, fine, provided that such requirements are proportionate to its value and its objectives. Just think about, how do you demonstrate that? Let's think about Concordia Bus. We want a bus transportation services system, and we want to make sure, let's say we put it not in the award criteria, we put it in the technical specifications. The buses used must not exceed certain stated, objectively defined emissions and discharge levels. How on earth do I go about demonstrating that the levels I've chosen, even though objectively defined, are proportionate to the value of the contract? Because by definition, they're externalities. They've got no connection with the value of the contract. And how do I demonstrate they're proportionate to the objective? Because then that opens up the question, what is the objective of the contract? Is the objective of the contract bus transportation services, or is it bus transportation services and environmental protection? It takes a whole argument back to the pre-Concordia days, when the Commission was cheerfully saying, you just can't do this. But instead of saying you can't do it, whilst clarifying the law that ostensibly says you can, we have this nice little proviso. 90%. I'll not spend much time on this, but there are provisions where you require third-party certificates to attest that various social or environmental management systems are in place. There are rules about that in the directive. I just put those there for sake of completeness. Now we come to exclusion. There are compulsory grounds for exclusion, one of which is important socially, which is an obligation to exclude for the use of child labour or human trafficking. I don't think people would argue with that. All of the compulsory exclusions can be derogated from by member states where they think necessary for overriding reasons of public health and protection of the environment. I can't see any situation in which human trafficking or child labour would be derogated from there, but I put that in for the sake of completeness. Also for the sake of completeness, as we've already seen, there's a non-compulsory power to exclude for failure to comply with an Article 15.2 obligation. Now we come to the basis of award, and this is an important area where big changes have been made, at least facially, at least by appearance. There's some conflict, actually, between the recitals and the substantive provisions on this, but my understanding of it is that the only basis of award now is award to the bidder who offers the most economically advantageous tender from the point of view of the contracting authority. But the contracting authority can define that in one of three ways. Best price. Best cost, using a life cycle costing model in accordance with Article 67, or best price quality ratio, in other words, the balance between price or cost and quality. And when that one is used, it's to be assessed on the basis of a whole range of factors which can be included, including environmental or social aspects linked to the subject matter of the contract. First of all, a word about price and cost. The directive allows member states to say to their contracting authorities, you may not award contracts just on the basis of price or cost. In other words, member states can require contracting authorities to take account of other non-price cost elements, and that's explained as being intended to encourage greater reference to quality in the purchasing process. As regards best cost, a life cycle costing approach is mandated, and that can include, it does include energy consumption, but also environmental externalities. climate performance, climate mitigation costs, and so on, as long as they're linked to the subject matter of the contract. Detailed rules are provided about life cycle costing, which I don't have time to go into. But one thing that's important to note is that if in any sector the European Union, has mandated a life cycle costing methodology, they will become compulsory in that sector, and they will be listed in at one of the annexes to the directive. It's made explicitly clear, though, that in the price-quality ratio approach, contracting authorities may not just rely upon price. So it may not just rely upon non-price or non-cost criteria. So you can't just say, well, look at the other things. But if a member state has said, well, we're fixing the prices, we're regulating to fix prices for these goods or services, then it is permissible only to look at quality. Here are the factors that can be taken into account, as well as cost and price. As I've said, accessibility, design for all users, social, environmental, innovation characteristics, trading and its conditions, fair trading requirements. And all of these criteria, these award criteria, are linked to the subject matter of the contract where they relate to works, supplies, or services at any stage of their life cycle. So this approach, this life cycle approach, is applied here, even when they don't form part of the specific substance of the thing purchased. So it's just like technical specs. Now the key thing here is that the concept of related to or linked to the subject matter of the contract is a key conceptual boundary. That's what marks out the things that contracting authorities are allowed to do, i.e. express preferences relating to what they're purchasing, rather than expressing attitudes as regards the general nature of companies. So it's not linked to the subject matter of the contract if you say to yourself, well, we're going to have an award criteria that that allows us not to give credit to bidders who have policies in other areas of which we don't approve. This is the boundary between acceptable commercial practice and what is regarded as not acceptable regulation by procurement, if you like. That's how that works. And it's defined here, which is helpful. This ties in with all of the case law we've had so far, Concordia, EVN, and Commission of Netherlands. Because of a debate I was involved in Sweden in the context of your public procurement inquiry with Professor Hetney, I thought this would be worth putting up. There's been a controversy about whether public bodies can seek high standards, products or services achieving high standards, or whether in some way that infringes EU law, an argument which I have to confess I never really understood. It's very clear here that contracting authorities are going to be encouraged to achieve high standards in their purchases, and that would go for environmental performance as well as anything else. Now, I've trespassed on your patience quite a lot, so I'll skip through these. Basically, the existing rules about award criteria, not allowing unlimited discretion, being clear and so on, they're all repeated in the directive. Equally, if we move on to contract performance conditions, it's made clear that you can include social and environmental aspects in these two, which was always the case under the last directive, although it's also made clear that environmental measures might be one of the things that you make a condition of performance of the contract. This isn't environmental, but reserved contracts, sheltered workshops. And here they add a proviso just so that we understand what a sheltered workshop is, the 30% of employees proviso. Finally, a big area of importance which is covered by the directives is eco-labels and fair trade labels. Again, I'll depart from my slides here and just explain it a bit more briefly. Under the Commission of Netherlands case, I think accurately reflecting the old text, the court held that whether it's technical specifications or award criteria, a purchasing body can't simply require that you have a label. because that's not sufficiently clear to be so that every potential purchaser can understand easily what's required. What you can do, according to that case, is you could adopt the specification of the label and set that out in your own documentation. And that might be all right, as long as the criteria met other requirements of the law. Now, we're getting to a position where contracting authorities may require the label in their technical specifications, their contract performance conditions, or their award criteria. Now, I shan't bore you with the rest of my slides, but the key point here is the Commission's draft directive was published before Commission in the Netherlands. I think if the process had started after Commission in the Netherlands, this provision might add a few more words just to clarify that what it means is the label's good enough. You don't also have to set out the whole specification of the label. I hope that's what this means, but it would be that bit clearer given that we have the decision in Commission in the Netherlands if it expressly had stated that that requirement to publish the specification of the label wasn't included. So there we are. Lots and lots of stuff about green procurement. Do I think it simplifies things? I'm not as polite as Peter. I'm going to say it rather more bluntly. Absolutely not. Overall, as a whole, I think this imposes potentially a burden on the procurement process, which the procurement process isn't easily able to bear. I don't know how many of you know about all those conventions. Somebody's going to have to give you guidance on them, what the obligations are that's supposed to be protected. I don't know how many of you are private international lawyers and understand about place of characteristic performance. Presumably you're going to become that. And all of these mays and shalls, is it mandatory? Is it discretionary? Who knows? So now I'm going to finish. Thank you for your attention. And please vote. Get that 90% up next time round. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. If there is one short question or reflection, I think we have time for that before we break for lunch. Okay. So we have... do we have the microphone over there? Har vi mikrofon till en frågeställare? Ta det helt kort. Mikrofonen är nog faktiskt här, men det fanns en till. Ja.
Hello, my name is Robert Molden. I am a PhD student at the University of Lund writing a thesis on competition and public procurement. And I would like to put you a very specific question on, you call it the compliance article or the principles for public procurement in 15.2. If you compare with 15.1, in 15.1 it says very stately it's directed to the contracting authorities. And what about the fact that 15.2 explicitly only is directed towards member states? Will it transfer cloud, actually? Will there be any legal implications before court procedures, or is this just a more of a general aim?
Well, you're right. 15.2 is aimed at the member state. They have a duty to ensure that. Well, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that member states are going to want to comply with their legal duty. Just assume that. How will they do it? Well, they will have to find a way within the national system to ensure that their contracting authorities do it. Well, how can the contracting authorities implement that? Well, they can implement it in the sort of ranges that I explained, non-compulsory exclusion and so on. So it cascades down, if the system works, it cascades down from the obligation of the member state, which will impose ensuring that the contracting authorities themselves do something about it. I guess you could alternatively say that actually you don't have to do it in the procurement context, you could do it in the general law. You could criminalize behaviors. Well, I guess the solution chosen by individual countries will depend, the outcome, the choice will depend upon the political view about criminalizing business conduct, which differs from state to state. On the other hand, if you're criminalizing certain conduct, wouldn't it be strange if the contracting authority nonetheless accepted that conduct? In other words, wouldn't there be some connection with the mechanisms whereby contracting authorities can exclude or whatever?
I think we have yet one question, a short one from
Jens Feyø. I'm
Jens Feyø from
Copenhagen.
Denmark. Yes.
My name is Jens Feyø. Your very interesting exposé dealt with complicity of the new rules, or the rules to be. What about the environment? Would that be improved in connection with public procurement? Thank you.
Right. Yes, it's a declaration I didn't make. I actually personally believe environmental protection is of absolutely the first importance. And that's why I had those arguments with the Commission all those years, saying, but surely you can't mean this. I mean, it seemed to me that the Commission's then position, which was you just can't do it in these ways, was disconnected from the social and political reality in many European countries. It would be outrageous from electorate's point of view if their government bodies, public bodies, were buying certain things and couldn't say, no, we don't want them on these environmental grounds. Now, whether this package will enhance environmental protection, I just don't know. To the extent it might, great. But is the procurement process, is the role of the purchasing officer and the procuring body, is that really the best way to achieve environmental protection? Now, this is where we tread into an ideological minefield. Because, of course, we live, generally speaking, I'll hide if people throw things, we live in neoliberal times. The European Commission, in particular, adopts neoliberal strategies. And that's why, when it had its economic problem, instead of taking a dirigiste approach, which in the old France might have done, we can't do that. We have to have a neoliberal approach. Oh, a market mechanism. Let's let the market do it, the classic neoliberal approach, and we'll use public procurement to do it. A movement away from command and control in environmental protection to market mechanisms. So, you pay your ideological money and you take your ideological choice. I don't know. I hope it protects the environment. We'll see. What I'm more sceptical about is whether it really will turn the European economy around. But that's just my skepticism.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. I think we need to finish here, and we have a lunch break at 10 minutes to 2, I think. We will reunite, come back here. Just det, 13:50, 10 minuter i 2 börjar programmet här igen. Thank you very much, Peter. A reflection from me, yes, of course, is that when I see some of the directives and what you've told us, is that sometimes they sort of manage to be both rigid and flexible at the same time.
And we hope the court makes something of it.
We hope the court makes something of it. Thank you very much indeed. Bon appétit.